Why did medieval knights not have daggers sooner? When someone asks you about medieval knightly weapons, probably the first thing you think of is the sword, and perhaps rightly so. In many ways, it was the symbolic weapon of the knight. But there are a few other weapons which were militarily and in combat just as important as the sword in the late medieval period. There's the spear on foot, or the lance on horseback. Certainly on horseback, the lance was the most important weapon. But for fighting on foot, the two-handed axe, which descended from these great axes which we see as early as the Norman conquest and going back into the Viking era, was still being used by knights on foot in the 14th century. And of course these evolved into things like the poleaxe, with its specialised hammers and spikes and top spikes and back spikes and even guards for the hand, which became popular really from the very end of the 14th century all the way through the 15th century and into the 16th century. But a weapon which was incredibly important for the late medieval knight, but which often gets overlooked, certainly not by students of HEMA I have to say, but often gets overlooked in wider kind of media and discussions about knights, is the dagger. And this is a specialised rondel dagger, but there was something which came before it. So let's look at why daggers were so important for medieval knights and where they came from. Hi folks, Mass Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Right, so we're going to be looking at the dagger today. We're going to be considering why the medieval dagger was so important for the knight, and also where did it come from, and it might surprise you. So there's no question that for the early history of the medieval knight, from the 11th and 12th centuries and into the 13th centuries, the most important weapons that they carried as mounted specialists, as heavy shock cavalry, were the lance and the shield. And indeed, when they fought on foot, undoubtedly, generally speaking, the most important weapons were the same shield and indeed the lance used as a spear on foot. But of course, spears and lances aren't always useful, especially in the close-in melee, especially if you've just embedded it in a mounted target. And so you need something as a backup, as a sidearm that you can easily wear at your belt, and it should go without saying that that is the sword. So really the shield, the heater shield it's sometimes known, but the knightly shield of the 11th and 12th centuries used with a sword were absolutely the kind of go-to weapons that came after the lance or spear on foot. So the sword was very widely and extensively used, but something which a lot of people perhaps are surprised by, and especially if you've kind of played video games or done fantasy role-playing games, everybody these days kind of thinks, well, obviously the backup to the sword would be the knife, right? Well, actually no, because the weird thing is we don't really see knives or daggers at the side of medieval knights until really quite late in the Middle Ages. Indeed, it seems right the way through the early medieval period and into the High Middle Ages, the standard sidearm was the knightly one-handed sword. Even when more two-handed varieties start to come along in the kind of late 12th and 13th centuries, the dagger or the knife is still not really a standard sidearm that we ever or practically never see in medieval art at the side of the knight. And indeed, we don't really find it barely ever mentioned. There's a few isolated examples, but it's barely ever mentioned in the written sources either. So contrary to what a lot of people think, the people who had shields and swords, the knights, wearing mail armour at this point with forms of helm, first of all conical helmets with nasals and later on great helms, they only had a sword as a sidearm. They didn't have a knife or a dagger. And that seems kind of weird to a lot of people, I guess. Like, why wouldn't they have a knife or dagger? And there must have been some kind of realization that the sword was good enough. If you were in close combat, fighting with a sword and shield, you're perhaps slightly less likely to end up grappling. They're wearing mail armor, so the point of your sword or indeed your spear are good enough, at least on a lucky day, to get through the mail. Just cleaving into the mail is going to be adequate, and you've got a shield on your left hand which makes grappling and wrestling kind of difficult anyway. So interestingly, we just don't see very much use of knives or daggers until we get to the 13th century. Now, the 13th century is very interesting because a lot of things start to change in warfare. You could argue that we start to see a greater use of lower status soldiers, shall we say, and not just levies, but also specific types of troops. We start to see a slightly increase in the use of crossbows and arguably also longbows or simple bows. But in addition to that, there is a big development of armour in the 13th century. So one thing we start to see develop is the so-called coat of plates. So formerly, people had been completely covered head to foot in mail armour that would have been over a lightly padded garment worn underneath, an accaton type thing, can go by various names. So light padding, then mail over the top, and the mail, certainly for a knight, not obviously for lower kind of status soldiers, but for knights, would literally cover you from the ends of your hands, mail mitten gauntlets, leather on the inside, full-length mail sleeves, full-length hauberk, and what are called chausses, or mail leggings, essentially, that cover your feet and legs. And then it would come up around the head in a coif, and on the top of the head you'd have usually a cevalier or an early form of bassinet with a great helm over the top. So you've got a plated head, but the rest of your body is covered in mail. So presumably in that situation, they didn't see the use of daggers yet. However, by the time we get into the 13th century, we're starting to see an increased use of plate defences, particularly on the torso. Now, this is hidden underneath the surcoat, the heraldic garment made of various materials over the top, which kind of hides what's going on underneath. But when we can see figures, for example, effigies, or in manuscript art, we can see them from the side, or sometimes where the surcoat is shortened or sort of pulled off or whatever, we start to see a garment underneath known as the coat of plates, which is kind of where the brigandine comes from. Larger plates, fewer of them, but covering quite a lot of the torso. In addition to that, we also start to see plate defences on the legs and on the arms to some degree, usually the legs first in most cases, knees and then shins, but then we start to see elbows, and ultimately we start to see even the beginnings of plate gauntlets as well. So, in the 13th century, you've got multiple types of new weapons coming onto the scene. The sort of poleaxe and halberds are starting to develop. The crossbow and the longbow seem to be becoming more and more important. Also, troops using sort of almost the beginnings, I guess, of pike blocks, when you start to see schiltrons and stuff like this coming in, certainly by the end of the 13th century. And we start to see daggers appear. Not only in the art, but also in the written sources. Not to say they were never mentioned before, but they start to be mentioned more regularly. So what I've got here is an example of a dagger from Todd Cutler. Now, this is actually a 14th century form, but it comes from a 13th century form, and it is the basilard. Now, I have talked about the basilard on this channel before. This is a really nice new example in the Todd Cutler line that I picked up recently at Fight Camp, my own event that I run once a year. You're very welcome to come to it instantly. Check out the Fight Camp events website. But Todd Cutler was trading there, really big stand, and did good business, selling lots of dice, knives and swords to everyone. And this particular type of dagger, although it got very popular in the 14th century, has its roots in the 13th century. Now, what's important to note is many of you will be familiar with the very specialised rondel dagger, but the rondel dagger doesn't come along until quite, well, say at least the middle of the 14th century, generally speaking. Okay, so this is a very specialised armoured fighting dagger. We'll get to that in a second. But before that, if you look at most knightly effigies from the early 14th century, so the early 1300s, they've usually got a basilard, but these first appear in the 1200s. And in fact, we can see early forms of basilard in the Morgan Bible, for example. So in the Morgan Bible, we actually see daggers used a number of times. We can see them carried. Interestingly, they're not shown worn very much, but they're shown being used. And that's quite interesting. So the Morgan Bible is about 1250, if I remember correctly. So the middle of the 13th century. Now, in the middle of the 13th century, we're moving from this period where everybody's just covered in mail to a period where there's starting to be more and more plate defences. Now, if you've got more and more plate defences, firstly, on a fundamental level, you're better protected. Okay, great. But we also start to see the gradual sort of increase in use of two-handed weapons and the abandonment of the shield. Not yet. It's not that the abandonment of the shield is something that happens more in the 14th century, but it's the beginnings of it. We're starting to see some knights on foot using two-handed weapons like cleavers and two-handed axes and not using a shield with them. And they're better protected, so they've got better armour on. And as we go into the 14th century, when these basilars start to appear more and more and more on knightly effigies and brasses, being shown by people who've got the beginnings of more and more plate armour, and we can see the coats of plates being shown out of the bottom edge of their surcoats, the dagger is more important. Why? Well, if a person is more heavily armoured, they are less vulnerable to swords and spears. Okay, we've talked about this a little bit recently in the various videos I've done talking about fighting pike blocks. Fundamentally, if you're wearing lots of armour, you can you might be pushed back, but you can sort of walk towards a pike block, and unless they can find an opening to stick the pike, it's not going to go through the armour. But, you know, that's also an issue with shields. Generally speaking, yes, a pike can push a shield back and might be able to stab around the shield, but very rarely would a pike be able to go through a shield. And, you know, we talk about swords. These types of swords start to develop stiffer, thicker, more slender blades with more acute points that are better for half swording and better at smashing through or jamming through mail in the gaps of plate armour. And there's a big contrast to the earlier types of cleaving swords, which were good enough against people wearing mail, because you could hit them really hard, you could cleave through bits which weren't covered in mail, and even quite broad points could potentially burst the rings to stab through mail, and there are accounts of this happening. Various types of weapons can stab through mail, and again, me and Todd have shown this. So the introduction of more and more plate armour means that you're more likely to come close to grappling. Now, if you come into a wrestling situation, the best tool in the world that you can have, pretty much, is some form of dagger. Okay, notice that the knives that come about, even as early as the early basilards, and there's forms of quillon dagger as well, they are very specifically stabbing daggers. They're not cleavers, they're not kukris, they're not bowie knives, they are stabbing daggers. So therefore stabbing, they're being worn by armoured knights for fighting other armoured knights. Ergo, they must be really useful in knightly combat. So, there's many things that start to happen with arms and armour in the 13th century and become even more prevalent in the 14th century. One of them is the development of swords, which become more thrust-oriented, better suited to half-swording, okay, which is something that's one way of overcoming a plate-armoured opponent. The other one is the beginning of specialised weapons like pole axes, which are better for dealing with armoured opponents than the earlier Dane axe, for example, which up until that point has still been in widespread use, sometimes with a spike on the back, but not always. And daggers. So the first daggers that came along were basilards, and these aren't only specialised, well, they are specialised for fighting armour. Obviously you can use them against unarmoured opponents as well, but notice also the design of the grip. Now, if you were designing a knife to use like a Fairbairn Sykes or a Bowie knife in an unarmoured normal civilian or kind of survivalist kind of environment, you probably wouldn't design a hilt like this, but this hilt is really good when you are armoured, for two important reasons. There's other reasons, but two really important reasons. One of them is, let's just try and find the scabbard for it, there it is. So one of them is, if you are fully armoured, helmet on, you know, with a closed visor or closed face on your helmet or not, if your basilard is down here, you have really good and easy ergonomic indexing and withdrawal of that knife, dagger, when you need it in a wrestling situation from the scabbard. Okay, number one, it's very easy to find with your hand without having to look at it, and it's very easy to pull out. Secondly, it's really good at retention, whether you have it in the ice pick grip, point down, or you have it in a conventional grip, point up. It's very good at staying in your hand. And at this point, when these first came about, it would have been a mailed fist, so chain mail, if you want to call it that, mitten around the hand, very good at staying in there. Later on, with the first plate gauntlets starting to come in with small plates combined with fabric, essentially, they, much like the coat of plates but on your hand, that would give good retention in the hand, okay, and be good at staying there and good at finding and good at pulling out. And this, as I've often pointed out, is a common feature with the rondel dagger. So actually, although these look very different, the basilard and the rondel dagger, certainly if you look at them that way, actually from the side and silhouette, they're very, very similar, okay? The guard doesn't stick out a long way. It's not fundamentally there to protect your hand very much. It's mostly about giving a lot of support for delivering force and a lot of platform for pulling out of the scabbard and retention, keeping in your hand when you're in a wrestling situation. And I would also mention the quillon dagger. So the quillon dagger comes around in the 13th century at the same time as the basilard. But it does seem, based on what I've seen anyway, looking at effigies and art, that the basilard seems to have been generally more popular than the quillon dagger. The quillon dagger just looks like a miniature sword. And I think some people probably chose it because it looked like a miniature sword. But actually in ergonomics, this is a specialised, relatively new design that didn't really exist before the 13th century. And this is very popular on effigies of knights, with a sword on one side, the dagger on the other. So there we go. Hopefully there are two main takeaways from this video to know. Firstly, the basilard, in my opinion, is the first specialised armoured fighting dagger in medieval Europe. And it got popular first in the 13th century, second half of the 13th century, and then got really popular in the 14th century, partly because it's so well suited for the armoured knight. And the reason that they wanted daggers at this time was because grappling is more likely to happen, you're more likely to come close and get into a wrestling situation with the growing spread of plate armour in addition to mail, because it's becoming harder and harder and harder for knights to kill each other, and they're more likely to come in close and get into grappling. So you need a dagger. But the final takeaway, and I think this is one that not a lot of people in the world are aware of, is that knives and daggers were not really worn by knights until the late 13th century, and really they became common in the 14th century. So we're talking the late medieval period. Some people would call that the beginning of the Renaissance. Certainly in Italy it was. So daggers worn by knights are more of a 14th and 15th century thing, and not really something from before that. Why didn't they wear knives and daggers before that? I would argue because they didn't really need them. I think if they'd needed them, they would have worn them, because they certainly existed. Knives and daggers have existed, obviously, since people worked out how to make sharpened pieces of stone and attach them to a stick. So I think if they'd needed them, they would have had them, but they didn't. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I hope this has been interesting and informative. I have been Matt Easton. I'll continue to be. I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.